Ric Flair once admitted that Vince McMahon lent him $800,000 when he was struggling financially. He needed money to pay his lawyer and support his ex-wife, and Vince stepped in at a time when Flair himself said he wouldn't have even lent that much to his own son. At 76 years old, Ric Flair is still full of surprises, and after decades of speculation, he finally revealed his true feelings about Vince McMahon. Fans always wondered if Flair saw Vince as a ruthless businessman or a trusted friend, but the story he shared turned out to be far more emotional than anyone expected. To understand the depth of their bond, you have to go back to 1991, when Ric Flair was WCW World Heavyweight Champion. Behind the scenes, his relationship with WCW executives, especially Jim Herd, had turned toxic. Herd wanted Flair to change everything about himself, cut his hair, wear an earring, and even become a gladiator-style character. Flair resisted, but the real breaking point came over $25,000. In the old NWA tradition, every world champion had to put down a $25,000 bond to guarantee they wouldn't leave the company with the championship belt. Flair had put down that money years earlier, with the understanding it would be returned when he lost the title. But when he asked for it back during contract talks, Herd flat out refused. For Flair, it wasn't just about the money, it was about respect. After carrying WCW for years and making them millions, he felt insulted and betrayed. That moment changed everything. Outraged, Flair picked up the phone and called Vince McMahon. He told him, "I'll come as the champion if you want me to be," and he even mailed the WCW belt to WWE. Soon after, Bobby the Brain Heenan appeared on WWE TV holding the championship, declaring that the real world's champion was coming. Fans were stunned. Flair had done the unthinkable. He had taken WCW's top prize straight to their biggest rival. WCW was left humiliated, all because they wouldn't return his $25,000 deposit. When Flair officially arrived at WWE in 1991, Vince McMahon had a chance to exploit the situation. Flair was desperate to escape WCW and was ready to accept almost anything. But instead of lowballing him, Vince offered something that completely surprised him. He told Flair, "I'm not going to give you a guarantee. I'll shake your hand to make you more money." That handshake wasn't just a deal. It was the kind of respect Flair had been missing. There were no lawyers, no endless contracts, just trust between two men. Vince backed up his word almost immediately. The original plan was for Flair to face Hulk Hogan in a dream match at WrestleMania 8, but when that fell through, Vince didn't punish him. Instead, he gave him a spotlight in the 1992 Royal Rumble. Flair entered the match at number 3, lasted over an hour, eliminated several opponents, and won the WWE Championship. It became one of the most legendary Rumble performances in history, proving Vince was serious about making Flair a star in WWE. What stood out to Flair was how Vince treated him behind the scenes. When Flair needed time off, Vince gave it. When creative choices had to be made, Vince didn't force them on him, he talked to him about them. Even when things went wrong, Vince dealt with it directly. During one match with Randy Savage in 1992, Vince was unhappy with the way interference was being handled, so he stopped the match midway, furious about the situation. But instead of blaming Flair, he pulled both men aside, fixed the problem, and then let them continue. That kind of personal involvement showed Flair that Vince wasn't just a boss. He was invested in making sure everything was done right. Their partnership became more than just business. It was built on trust, loyalty, and the kind of respect Flair had never gotten in WCW. That handshake deal from 1991 had turned into a bond that would last for decades. Still, by 1993, WWE was beginning to shift directions, and Flair was being moved down from the main event spotlight into more of a supporting role. It was the first real test of their relationship, and it would force Flair to make another difficult decision. At the same time that Ric Flair's role in WWE was being reduced, WCW came calling again. The company's new management wanted him back and was willing to pay big money for his return. This was the moment that would test everything Flair had learned about Vince McMahon's character. Flair had a verbal agreement with Vince that allowed him an escape clause. If WWE no longer had main event plans for him and he received a better offer elsewhere, Vince promised he would release him from his contract. It was the kind of deal that could have been ignored, twisted, or dragged into legal battles, but Vince McMahon honored it completely. Flair later explained, "I chose to leave WWF when I was being moved to a mid-card spot and Bill Watts offered me the chance to come back to WCW. Vince could have made things difficult. He could have stripped Flair of his remaining appearances or punished him for wanting out, but he didn't. Instead, Vince allowed him to finish his scheduled house shows and even join WWE's European tour before leaving. Flair's exit was handled with grace and dignity. There were no lawsuits, no bitterness, no drama. Vince's professionalism showed Flair exactly what kind of man he was. Even in a situation where he was losing one of his top stars, Vince kept his word and treated Flair with respect. That stuck with Flair for the rest of his life. During his second WCW run, Flair often thought about the differences between the two companies. WCW might have offered him more money and even creative control, but the respect and professionalism he felt in WWE were unmatched. To Flair, Vince's handshake meant more than any written contract WCW could ever put on the table. The wrestling industry was heating up like never before. WWE's Monday Night Raw was battling WCW's Monday Nitro head-to-head, and the rivalry became known as the Monday Night Wars. Both companies tried to outspend each other, offering massive contracts and stealing talent whenever possible. Despite this cutthroat competition, Flair and McMahon never attacked each other publicly. They didn't exchange insults, and they didn't let the business rivalry ruin their personal friendship. They respected each other's choices, even while working for opposing sides. As WCW began to fall apart creatively in the late 1990s, Flair sometimes wondered what his career might have looked like had he stayed with Vince instead of going back to WCW. The money was good, but the frustrations were endless, and WWE's steady quality made WCW's problems even more obvious. Still, Flair's greatest test of loyalty was yet to come. When Vince McMahon bought WCW in 2001, everything changed. Suddenly, they were no longer rivals. The big question was whether Vince would still see Flair as a partner and legend, or if he would treat him simply as another WCW name swallowed up in the takeover. What happened next proved that their bond went far beyond business. When Vince purchased WCW in March 2001, he gained the biggest wrestling tape library in history, dozens of contracts, and the rights to use WCW's famous storylines and characters. But there was one prize he wanted most: the return of Ric Flair. When Flair came back to WWE in November 2001, it wasn't just another signing. Vince gave him an introduction worthy of his legacy. In the storyline, Flair revealed himself as the new co-owner of WWE, having purchased Shane and Stephanie McMahon's shares during the WCW invasion angle. The crowd went wild as Flair became Vince's on-screen business partner and rival. This wasn't a small cameo or nostalgia act. Flair was immediately placed into main event storylines with some of WWE's biggest stars, including The Undertaker, Triple H, and even Vince himself. At 52 years old, Flair was treated like the icon he was. His feud with Vince led to a brutal street fight at the 2002 Royal Rumble, which was praised by fans and showed that Flair could still perform at a high level. But behind the curtain, their relationship was as solid as ever. There was no real bitterness in their rivalry. It was simply great television built on trust. Vince continued to show his confidence in Flair throughout the 2000s. He was given huge roles, such as being the storyline co-owner of WWE, running Raw during the brand split while Vince ran SmackDown, and taking part in key storylines that shaped the era. Even when Flair went through some of the darkest struggles in his personal life, Vince didn't abandon him. He continued to support him, reminding Flair that the respect they built back in 1991 still meant something. When Ric Flair's financial problems became public, Vince McMahon never took advantage of the situation. He didn't try to cut Flair's pay or use his vulnerability against him. When Flair faced personal tragedies in his family, Vince showed support without asking for anything in return. Years later, Flair admitted that every promise Vince ever made to him had come true. Vince once told him, "I'm going to put you back on," and he did. For Flair, McMahon not only restored his confidence but also gave him purpose again and reminded him why he loved wrestling so deeply in the first place. Their partnership worked because both men understood their roles perfectly. McMahon gave Flair the platform and the creative vision, while Flair brought the star power, charisma, and performances that made fans care. Neither man tried to overshadow the other or take full credit for their shared success. By the time Flair was 76, he finally made it clear how he felt about Vince McMahon. Their bond wasn't built on convenience or short-term business needs. It was built on decades of mutual respect and true appreciation for each other's talent. McMahon's greatest gesture of respect came during one of the most emotional nights in wrestling history. On March 31, 2008, Ric Flair gave his farewell speech on Monday Night Raw after wrestling Shawn Michaels in his retirement match at WrestleMania 24. After nearly 40 years in the business, Flair was saying goodbye, and the entire wrestling world came together to honor him. Triple H led a procession of legends and stars, from Shawn Michaels to the Four Horsemen, Ricky Steamboat, Harley Race, Chris Jericho, and even The Undertaker. One by one, they broke character to thank Flair for everything he had given to the sport. Then, at the height of the ceremony, Vince McMahon himself walked to the ring. The crowd immediately felt the weight of his presence. But instead of taking over the spotlight, Vince quietly stood in the background and let Flair soak in the love of his peers and fans. The most powerful man in wrestling chose to step aside so that the night could belong entirely to Flair. That simple gesture said more about their relationship than any speech could. It showed that McMahon understood his role, not as the star of the night, but as someone who added gravity by being present while allowing Flair to shine. The sight of rivals and allies standing together, united in respect for Ric Flair, was one of the rarest and most genuine moments in WWE history. For once, the scripted world of wrestling disappeared, and pure emotion took its place. While Vince had organized similar tributes for other legends, none carried the same emotional power as Flair's farewell. Later that year, Flair briefly came out of retirement to confront Chris Jericho. Vince didn't fight the decision or criticize it. Instead, he trusted Flair's instincts, knowing that even in retirement, Flair had a strong sense of what was best for the business. The tribute night marked the peak of their professional relationship, but their personal friendship continued long after. Even when Flair worked in TNA, WWE's rival company, Vince stayed in touch. He checked on Flair, gave him advice, and continued to offer support. Flair eventually said publicly that he needed people to know how much McMahon had meant to him. For Flair, this was more than business. Vince had given him respect, dignity, and a platform to perform at every stage of his career. That kind of loyalty was rare in wrestling. But as years went by, Vince himself became surrounded by controversy. By 2022, his world began to fall apart. Sexual misconduct allegations, secret payments, and corporate investigations dominated headlines. The Wall Street Journal published damaging reports, sponsors pulled out, and WWE's stock began to drop. Stories of toxic workplace culture spread, and media outlets that once celebrated Vince focused only on his alleged failures. For most wrestling figures, this was the moment to walk away from Vince. Speaking positively about him could damage their own reputations. Many stayed silent or issued carefully crafted statements that avoided choosing sides. In July 2022, Vince retired from WWE, ending a 50-year career that had shaped wrestling into a global entertainment empire. Even when he returned in early 2023 as executive chairman to oversee the company's sale, the controversy only grew worse. For current WWE stars, it was impossible to comment freely without risking their jobs. For many former employees, old grievances colored their opinions. But Ric Flair's response would show that sometimes, true loyalty and friendship last longer than public opinion or temporary scandal. Industry journalists suddenly felt free to write critical stories about Vince McMahon that they might have avoided in the past. But Ric Flair was in a very different position. At 76 years old, with his career and legacy secure, he no longer needed WWE for anything. That gave him the freedom to speak his mind without worrying about his future. Many wrestlers and former employees chose to stay quiet or give vague answers whenever McMahon's controversies came up in interviews. They knew any comment could be twisted or misunderstood, possibly hurting their own reputations. Flair, however, did the exact opposite. Instead of dodging the subject or playing it safe, he doubled down on his loyalty and chose to defend McMahon in the most public way possible. When Flair appeared on the Joe Rogan Experience, one of the biggest podcasts in the world, he knew that everything he said would be replayed, dissected, and debated. He could have brushed the subject off with a safe, generic answer about separating business from personal relationships. But instead, he spoke from the heart. With the same confidence and intensity that made him wrestling's greatest talker, Flair made it clear how he felt. In April 2023, millions of listeners around the world heard his shocking declaration. When Rogan brought up McMahon's controversies, Flair didn't hesitate. "He's my hero," Flair said, without any attempt to soften his words. In just 3 words, he made his position undeniable. For months, fans and journalists had wondered how wrestling legends really felt about Vince McMahon. While most whispered behind closed doors or avoided giving a straight answer, Flair laid everything bare. And he wasn't finished. Flair explained, "I judge people by how they treat me, and he has treated me like I've never had anyone treat me with more respect ever in this business. He's a great guy. I don't care what he does. He's my hero." The impact was immediate. Social media blew up with reactions, and wrestling news sites scrambled to analyze every part of Flair's statement. Some praised his loyalty, while others criticized him for ignoring the seriousness of McMahon's scandals. But no one could deny the power of his words. Flair's declaration stood out because it wasn't politically safe, it wasn't rehearsed, it was raw, emotional, and honest. Importantly, Flair wasn't brushing off or mocking the allegations made against McMahon. He wasn't saying those things didn't matter. He was only speaking about his own personal experience over 4 decades of working with Vince. And his testimony carried a unique weight because Flair himself had lived through plenty of controversy. The Nature Boy had faced scandals, criticism, and personal failures that gave him a different perspective on judging people during their lowest moments. For Flair, loyalty was simple. He stood by the people who had stood by him. In an industry famous for backstabbing, politics, and betrayal, that kind of principle was rare. His words also showed the complexity of real relationships. A person could be accused of serious wrongdoing and still, at the same time, have treated others with genuine kindness and respect. Flair made it clear that he wasn't denying other people's stories or dismissing their pain. But when it came to his own truth, he chose to defend the man who had always kept his word to him. Ric Flair made it very clear that he was only speaking about his own personal experiences with Vince McMahon, not about the allegations others had raised. What made his declaration even more powerful was the timing. To say something positive about McMahon in the middle of such a huge controversy took real conviction. Flair had nothing to gain and a lot to lose by standing up for him so boldly, yet he did it anyway. His words came across with the same honesty and intensity that had always defined him as one of wrestling's most compelling voices. He wasn't looking for approval or trying to please anyone. He was simply telling his truth. The reaction was immediate and divided. Some people praised Flair for his loyalty and authenticity, while others questioned his judgment and the timing of his comments. The wrestling community found itself split over whether personal relationships should be separated from public allegations. But for Flair, the decision wasn't complicated. McMahon had earned his loyalty through decades of consistent respect and fair treatment, and no amount of criticism or public pressure was going to change that. His statement reminded everyone that real relationships are often much more complex than the headlines make them seem. Flair's defense of McMahon wasn't just about one legend standing up for another. It highlighted bigger truths about loyalty, character, and the complexity of human relationships. At 76, Flair had nothing left to prove. His legacy was already secure, his financial future stable, and his reputation built over decades. That gave his words a special weight. They were completely authentic. When he called McMahon his hero, it wasn't for shock value. It was because that's how he truly felt. The statement also challenged the simple narratives about Vince McMahon's character. While the serious allegations against him deserved attention, Flair offered another perspective. The McMahon he knew had always treated him with dignity, fairness, and respect. Their relationship was proof that trust built over decades could survive even the worst controversies. For the wrestling world, Flair's loyalty showed that not every bond should be abandoned when times get tough, especially if it's built on mutual respect. In an industry where fair-weather friends are common, true loyalty is rare and powerful. This moment also revealed a lot about Flair himself. His willingness to speak out when so many others stayed silent reflected the same courage that had made him a standout figure in wrestling for 5 decades. He wasn't afraid to take risks, whether inside the ring or outside of it. His words gave fans a glimpse of a side of McMahon they'd never see on television, the private man who had supported and respected him for years. Of course, Flair's comments also highlighted how complicated it is to deal with moral issues in today's media world. Social media and non-stop news cycles demand quick judgments and clear positions, but real relationships are rarely that simple. Flair's choice to speak from the heart, even when it went against the grain, will likely be remembered as one of the defining moments of McMahon's controversial final years in WWE. While many stayed quiet or distanced themselves, Flair reminded everyone that loyalty, authenticity, and courage were still part of who he was. Those same qualities had made both Flair and McMahon wrestling legends, and even in their most difficult moments, they continued to shape their actions. What do you think about Ric Flair's shocking loyalty to Vince McMahon despite all the controversy? Share your thoughts in the comments and don't forget to subscribe for more wrestling stories and insider revelations.